Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lauren Cerullis from Brussels, and I am hosting a Politico Spotlight event on cybersecurity, and specifically on securing critical infrastructure this afternoon. We've got a panel discussion coming up with some very qualified speakers to talk about critical infrastructure and cybersecurity. And we are hosting this event together with our partner, the Aspen Institute Romania, which is holding a series of events during its Bucharest Forum 2020, between the dates of October 8 and October 19. We at Politico, we do this Spotlight event together with the Aspen Institute, and this is part of our cybersecurity coverage that we do from Brussels for Europe. I'd like to thank you all for joining us online. I will introduce our panelists that we will be discussing this topic with in a little while. But first of all, I'd like to encourage you to head to a online application called Slido if you want to engage in this discussion. If you want to ask questions or you want to intervene in what you hear, I can encourage you to go to slido.com, that's sli.do.com, from your computer or phone, and use the hashtag Politico Spotlight to ask your questions. I can also encourage you to head to Twitter and to engage with the audience and with our panelists during the discussion, and you can use the hashtag Politico Spotlight for that. And also our events account, which is account Events Politico. Before we head into the discussion and we go into the threats Europe's critical infrastructure is facing, I'd like to give the floor to Alexandra Gatej, who is acting president of the Aspen Institute Romania and our partner in hosting this event. Alexandra, thank you so much for this partnership, and please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. I'm delighted to be able to open this panel of such distinguished guests on the topic of critical infrastructure. In my opening statements, I thought I would address a different angle of the critical infrastructures, and that is the people critical infrastructure. And for this angle of mine, I will use the example of Aspen, Romania. We are part of the international network of the Aspen Institutes around the world. And we in the Aspen Institute Romania was founded 15 years ago with the aim to develop an environment of fundamental debates and substantive contributions to Romania's success as a democracy, as an open society. With a proven track record across government and business cycles, the Institute has since then become the prime Romanian organization for leadership education, for strategic reflection, and a major convening platform for non-partisan policy debates. Our leadership, policy, and public programs support our mission to foster value-based leadership, encouraging individuals to reflect and act in accordance with the ideals and the ideas that define a good society. Using the Aspen method, we provide a transparent, neutral, multi-stakeholders venue for discussing and acting on critical issues confronting our societies. And that's why I'm saying that the Aspen Institute Romania is a critical people infrastructure that convenes, debates, formulates, and educates for the progress of my country, and not only. The network of fellows and alumni of our leadership programs comprises hundreds of extraordinary individuals from 28 different nations already, all group ages and all walks of life. after launching in 2018 a new fellowship-based leadership program dedicated to the most promising leaders of the public sector in Romania, the Aspen Public Service Leadership Program, we will continue to invest in the promoters of change and improvement in this crucial segment of the Romanian society. Ladies and gentlemen, the magnitude of the COVID-19 crisis has surpassed the consequences of any previous financial and geopolitical shocks. The pandemic has produced important mutations on how our politics, economies, and societies function, while its effects are long-lasting. The power to adapt to the new realities and to mitigate the effects of this and future crises relies not only on the imagination, vision, and strength of our leaders and elites, but also on the resilience of our economies, communities, and societies. In these times of crisis, our Institute managed to maintain the relevance of its activity, remaining close to its mission of promoting value-based leadership and providing transparent, neutral, multi-stakeholders venue for discussing and acting on critical issues confronting our society. The 9th edition of our Bucharest Forum is called Resilience, Pandenomics, and the Great Acceleration. Is organized, as you said before, between October 8 and 16, and it illustrates how the Aspen Institute Romania adapts its activity to its current challenges, continuing to offer a platform for multiple stakeholders dialogue. We engage more than 120 high-level officials, private sectors leaders, personalities from the academic life, recognized experts and prestigious journalists from all over Europe, Asia and America, in advancing the cause of a healthier, more prosperous and more secure, hence more resilient, post-COVID-19 world. Aiming to foster resilience in the face of the challenges posed by the pandemic and to discuss lessons learned and possible solutions, providing concrete policy recommendations for recovery, this year's edition of the Bucharest Forum is organized in partnership with the Government of Romania, the Romanian Presidential Administration, the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of National Defense, the National Bank of Romania, the European Parliament Committee on Industry, Research, Telecom and Energy. Certainly not last, we are glad to partner with such a prestigious media organization as POLITICO, hoping that the partnership that we have developed during this year's edition of Bucharest Forum will offer perspective of future cooperation. Finally, I would like to wish the panelists of this session a fruitful debate on such a significant topic as critical infrastructures. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Those are kind words to start off this session. I think it's high time for me to introduce our panelists and give you a bit of a background on where they come from so that we can have this discussion on securing critical infrastructure. First on the panel is Alejandro Cainzos, who's a member of the cabinet of Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager in charge of security and cybersecurity at the European Commission. You could call him one of the main architects of an upcoming reform of Europe's rules on critical infrastructure. So that gives us plenty to talk about. Welcome, Alejandro. Second on the panel is Guilherme de Aguiar Patriota, who's Consul General of Brazil, based in Mumbai, India, but importantly also chairs the UN group of governmental experts in advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace. We'll be talking about the international discussion on cyber norms with him, of which he's obviously one of the major experts across the world. Welcome, Guilherme. And third on the panel is Jaya Balu, cybersecurity expert and chief information security officer at cybersecurity firm Avast Software. High experience on the ground, so we'll be getting the interesting details on what's happening from her. Welcome, Jaya. If you don't mind, Jaya, I'm going to start with you to just get us started real quickly on... give me a brief second. I'm getting information that Jaya is briefly offline, but I'm sure she'll come back up. So we'll pick it up with her in a little while. So if you don't mind, Alejandro, I'll turn to you for a first question. obviously, Europe prides itself for its power on regulation. This is one of the things that the European Commission often likes to say, and also globally, countries are looking at Europe when it comes to regulation. In terms of cybersecurity, we've had a reform or we've had rules on critical infrastructure and the security of critical infrastructure for a couple of years now, called the NIS Directive, but these rules are now being revised. So I wanted to start there with you, if you don't mind, because if we look at the security of critical infrastructure in practice, how have you seen that change as a response to the new rules under the NIS Directive? And from there on, I would like to ask you a couple of points on how we can even improve that in an upcoming review.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm glad to see Jaya is back, and I'm looking forward to hear from her. Maybe because you mentioned the importance of legislation, I think I want to first take a step back and say that, of course, legislation is important, but it's only one part of the cybersecurity puzzle. The way we approach it is through a comprehensive approach. So a comprehensive, I would say, both vertically and horizontally, meaning if you look at critical infrastructure, you would need to tackle through different policies and programs that we have everything that goes from the cyber hygiene and digital skills of the individuals handling the system, all the way to the obligations of the operators, the security of the networks, the member states' capacities, and of course the international norms, which we will talk about. And horizontally, because I think in the Commission on digital, we always try to incorporate the cybersecurity component. So not only the legislation, but everything from virus tracing apps recently, through R&D programs, through the security requirements we put in EU funding. So it's a broader picture in which the NIS directive that you mentioned fits in. And specifically on the directive, I think it is fair to say that this directive has raised the bar on attackers. It has increased the cost. You can never guarantee that an attack will not succeed, but it has made it more difficult. I think we see three main benefits. First of all, to ensure that companies are better protected. By placing legal requirements on certain operators, we see that this is one of the main drivers for more spending. It incentivizes the directors and boards to take those decisions to spend more on cybersecurity. The second point is the role of member states, which in itself is important, and I think NIS directive has helped them develop their capabilities. So, for example, before the directive, 5 member states which had a cybersecurity strategy. Now they all do. And finally, but not least, it certainly has helped increase trust within the EU on cybersecurity, which is obviously the baseline for everything we do in terms of cooperation, information sharing, awareness, etc. So all of this creates an ecosystem that is more resilient to attacks. But indeed, as you said, we are in the process of reviewing this directive. There are some gaps. It can be improved. This is why this commission announced that we would move the review a little bit forward. We have launched a public consultation, which closed on the 2nd of October. So right now we're analyzing the replies we received, which will give us a very thorough picture of how the directive has been implemented on the ground. But I think we can already more or less see where are the main areas of improvement. So I will very briefly mention 3, but happy to discuss more in detail if you wish. First of all, obviously on the scope, the sectors that are covered. We have seen digitization advance significantly since the directive was first proposed back in 2013, which is not long ago in Brussels years, but a long time in digital years. Second aspect is the single market perspective, because if what we see in terms of uneven implementation among member states, that creates level playing field issues when you have different companies in the same sectors, or different companies in different member states having different requirements. So we need a little bit more streamlining. And finally, on cooperation, which, as I said, already improved a lot, but we think that we can do more, and we can gradually move to, let's say, a more ad hoc system of cooperation, to more systematic information sharing, etc. So no final decisions taken yet. Of course, we have an impact assessment ongoing, and our ambition is to present this revised proposal on the 14th of December. It is ambitious, but we hope we can get there.
Great, thank you. I think since we're in a stage of taking input, or the Commission's in a stage of taking input and ideas, let me just turn to Jaya on that one. So Jaya, if you don't mind, so could you just tell us, being sort of, on the ground, being involved in incident mitigation, incident response, and the actual, the practice of cybersecurity. First of all, what's your assessment in terms of European countries' cyber resilience when it comes to critical infrastructure, and to what extent has NIS, in your perspective, contributed or not to that?
So I think if we take the starting point is, NIS is like a good place to start. Let me start by saying that. So it's just, it leaves some things short, but let's start with what it actually does. It does indeed have three parts. The first thing is what it tries to do to increase or harmonize the capabilities at the national level. They're asking for every state in the EU to have certain things that they can do, so that they have to have like a national cybersecurity incident response team. So every state has that, and they have to, make sure that they can actually do something. So they have to do exercises, and they have to practice between them. And when I say between them, it's also with other states. So they have to have cybersecurity capabilities, like with a team, and then they have to practice these capabilities with each other. So they're asking for a certain level of collaboration, if you will, between states. And, they want to have this group of certs sharing information, which is super important to everything in cybersecurity. And I have to be honest, even now, even though there is this idea of cross-border collaboration, it's still not at the place that it should be. Because the biggest thing that makes a difference when we're talking about threats is knowing about it. That's the first thing. And then your speed to respond to the threat, that makes all the difference. So if you don't know about it and you don't know how to handle it, then you're pretty much screwed. And the final thing is, and I think this is the area where I get a little bit grumpy, but that's because I used to be the CISO of a critical infrastructure provider. And the thing that makes me upset is what they actually required all of these critical sectors to be able to do. So, also be able to have a cert, and also to be able to have this stuff. And when you're in the critical sector in a European country, you already have certain regulatory requirements. So you're already doing a lot of these things. What's not there, which is the scope aspect, is that our ability to follow through with vulnerabilities in particular products, that scope of NIS should have been extended to the software and hardware community. So my biggest gripe with the NIS is not the goals that it was trying to achieve, but who it was applied to achieve them.
And just to illustrate that, software and hardware providers, suppliers, and who are we talking about in that case? Are there a couple of examples that come up?
Yeah, well, we could talk about, the usual suspects, the Facebook, the Apples, etc. And of course, there is an extension of the NIS for cloud and digital service providers, I believe. So like online marketplaces and stuff like that, and search engines. But this isn't enough. You want the folks that make the tools that we all rely upon to have the same capability. So what I used to find super frustrating when I was working at this critical infrastructure provider, this telecom company, is that we would find things and have a cert, but there would be no relevant cert at the hardware software company that we found the problem in. So our ability to respond to something we did know about was really poor because we had no partner to fix the software or hardware that we're trying to remediate.
One idea that came up in a discussion at another event earlier this week, Alejandro, is to basically lower the threshold for companies in terms of mandatory reporting. And what was meant by that, and this was a European Commission official that said it 2 days ago, if I'm not mistaken, who's involved in the drafting of the revision, is to increase obligations on incident reporting, mandatory obligations, and make sure that more companies, more people affected start doing this on a mandatory basis. Would you agree with that idea?
Well, I think this is certainly one of the options we are very seriously considering, and as I said, we've just finished the consultation, so we are going through the responses at the moment. I think a priori we do see that we do have a feeling that the current threshold might be too low, might be too high. Sorry, because not enough incidents actually get reported. So a lower threshold might help. In terms of who is reporting, that is obviously linked to the discussion on the scope, as I said earlier. But it's only one of the options. I mean, another option is also to improve in the direction of streamlining the reporting. So, for example, to make them more meaningful or to facilitate it through templates. It always helps responses and collaboration if everyone speaks the same language, and if you have multinationals in cross-border events, for example, then it facilitates things. But final thing I want to say on that is that obviously mandatory reporting is important, but we also, I think, as a community, need to facilitate voluntary reporting, both within the private sector and the public sector, because there is no reason to wait reaching that threshold for mandatory reporting to share information, because as Jay has said, that is really the key. And you might have incidents that were successfully contained, but others in the sector can benefit from that experience.
Jay, if I can get your thoughts on that, do you think mandatory reporting versus voluntary reporting, what are the benefits and what are the pitfalls here?
So I think the biggest reason to have mandatory reporting is because you really want to understand what is going wrong in the case that a government or a centralized entity would need to step in and offer support. So there is a lot to be said for mandatory reporting. But my biggest gripe with mandatory reporting is you should be able to do something with it. So if all of these parts of critical infrastructure are doing the mandatory reporting, what is the benefit to them at the end of that reporting phase? So do you get an annual report where you become, just for one sector, so pick a sector, banking, telecom, energy, just that sector alone, do an analysis of what were the reasons that were reported just in one calendar year and give a sort of root cause found analysis for those different issues. You know, have the postmortems ready so that we're learning from incidents, so that we increase our learning capacity if we must do mandatory reporting. I'm a huge fan of streamlining it because unfortunately, when it comes to mandatory reporting, there's not a single centralized agency you need to report to, but multiple places. So you have to report to the person who is the regulator for your sector. You have to report to some cybersecurity agency. Potentially, there's also a privacy consequence as a result of your cybersecurity event. So you're reporting to at least 3 or 4 different places, which makes no sense for anyone. It's job creation in the wrong way. So I think that we can be doing that a lot better. As for incentivization of reporting, if it's not mandatory, the biggest thing here is if we don't penalize the reporter and we provide a sort of, you know, the cost of reporting is this, but the benefit you get back from reporting is the following, and that it becomes a sort of positive thing to improve the system for others by doing the reporting, then I would see how you would increase participation.
Alejandro, I'll throw this at you because the element of having different authorities obviously is something that the Commission has looked into as well. What's your take on that? Is it possible to streamline this? We're dealing with different sectors. We're dealing also with intersections of privacy and cybersecurity, for instance. How are you planning to tackle that?
Well, I think there are several things to unpack in that. I mean, first of all, on the interaction between privacy and security, these are obviously related, but they're not really the same, right? You may have security incidents that are very grave and serious without privacy implications. So it is only natural that there are requirements that apply to both things. So yes, there could be some reporting overlaps. You might report to both a cyber agency or a DPA. It can happen, but I think there is a limit of how much one could streamline to solve 2 very important problems of their own right. I think the what we are certainly looking at very, very carefully is this question of overlaps between the horizontal NIS Directive and the sectorial legislation, the sectorial framework. I think we're very conscious about the need to ensure coherence and avoid duplication, and that is certainly what we do in our proposals. So the NIS Directive will provide what is the horizontal basis, let's say the minimum requirements, but there might be some sectors in which you may need to go over and above. The financial services sector is one example, because we just issued a legislation on digital operational resilience within that sector. But again, there is no contradiction there. This is just requirements that go beyond for good reasons. And I think we make sure in our proposals that this is the case, and we of course will work with the co-legislators to ensure it remains the case as the legislation moves forward.
If you don't mind, I would like to highlight one sector that's particularly in the news these days, which is the election systems and elections as a critical infrastructure. Also the IT and the networks that underpin elections in Europe. Obviously, for the Commission, this is a tricky question because of competence issues and because electoral law is squarely a member state responsibility. But still, Alejandro, I'd like to ask you, how would you respond to the question of what are the obligations that an electoral system should fall under when it comes to critical infrastructure?
As you rightly say, there are some competence issues there. I think what I could say is that certainly there is no doubt that elections are critical, and protecting them from a cybersecurity perspective is crucial. Whether elections are infrastructure is maybe a more philosophical question, but what is clear is that all the actors involved must take appropriate measures to protect elections. Some of that actors might fall under some of the legislation we're talking about, others not, because of different reasons. But I think the overall sense of direction is clear. And I would say, going back to the whole trust and cooperation angle, that we've had some good experience. So, for instance, last year, ahead of the European election, which is, I believe, the second biggest democratic exercise in the world, you will have 7 different elections taking place at the same time. So what we did through precisely the cooperation group that was built through the NIS Directive was to create a compendium of good practices on protecting elections, which then each of those member states could take back and use. So this is a good example of beyond whose competence is what. If we create an ecosystem that promotes this kind of, it can also lead to solutions.
This seems to be a approach that the Commission took, or at least the NIS cooperation group, so national authorities, took in the case of this compendium on election security. In the case of 5G security, there was also a question of competence, and I think there too the Commission took sort of an approach of pooling resources and coming to a consensus, but not necessarily treading on member states' competence. Jaya, what do you make of this? Do you think this is Europe's weakness, or do you think Europe can actually get some benefits out of this sort of, this mixed approach of having European policy, but at the same time relying on member states this much?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it creates opportunities in the sense that you have the ability to pick and choose from best practice. But I would prefer, in most cases, to have some harmonization, again, for the collaborative aspect. I think while there are certainly some very good national initiatives, in order for us to really get better and combat the global nature of these threats, it would be far better to have a higher, a level up, if you will, at every nation.
One more idea for you, Jaya, that I would like to have your thoughts on, which is vulnerability disclosure programs. This is often mentioned as sort of an easy way for companies, at least, to build in some more resilience, to make sure that they have an interaction with the cybersecurity community as well. What do you think? Should this just simply be put into the future regulatory framework, and we should run with it?
Absolutely. I mean, look, to be very honest, there is already an ISO norm about how to do coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So, how companies can actually ingest reports that are being provided by the security community, by hackers. And there's different ways to do this. So, whether or not you do this by just having a mail address that people can contact you on your website, or you actually go a step further and have a bug bounty program where you can actually pay for the work of security researchers, that's up to every company. And this is not only applicable for companies that make software and hardware, but this is for every company that's online. It's for every company that has a website. It's for every company that puts a product out there that then can be contacted on the security of that product. At the same time, I think that we need to agree that the norms that are there for coordinated vulnerability disclosure is something that should be accepted, because this is like an ISO standard. This is something that we can all stand behind and embrace thoroughly as a norm across the EU. But it requires us to also have a certain degree of maturity when it comes to, for example, the agreements that we've made with things like Wassenaar, how we feel about hackers hacking and being able to do their disclosure. And also, when I was at my former employer, we used to find almost every month a new 0-day type of attack, which we would very normally report back to the maker of the product where we found this brand new attack. And unfortunately, what you see is that the nature of these 0 days is not everyone is reporting in the same way. And there are a lot of countries that see the importance of stockpiling or hoarding these 0 days for offensive operations. And for me, this is the root of all evil. So if we're going to have a vulnerability management, vulnerability disclosure program, we also need to discuss how we deal with vulnerabilities for offensive purposes from nation states at the same time.
This seems to bring us to the next big question of this debate. And Guilherme, I'm going to bring you in a little bit. We're going to be discussing the international level and the extent to which governments around the world can actually agree and have agreed on what should be acceptable in terms of critical infrastructure. But first of all, I would like to bring in a question from the audience. We've got one from Octavian Popescu. And this question relates to resources. So the lack of resources, both in terms of expertise and funding allocated, is part of the problem, Octavian says. So what is your opinion on addressing the lack of resources at EU level? Is enough being invested in cybersecurity? This is an open question, so anyone who raises his hand can take it. If no one does, I'll throw it at Alejandro.
Can start. I think what is the right level of funding and investment is a question in the eye of the beholder. I think we've come a long way from where we were a few years ago to where we will now. We have an in principle agreement by the European leaders on the next European long-term budget, where we will have much more capacity to finance R&D on cybersecurity. We also have, as you know, this extraordinary instrument for the recovery from the COVID crisis, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where we have announced a 20% target for digitization, and within this 20%, we hope that a good chunk of that will be invested. So altogether, I think we have much more means that we ever had. So it's a question of certainly of using them wisely and efficiently.
Great. If you don't mind, I'm going to turn to the element of. Sorry, Jaya, you wanted to jump in there?
Yes, well, I just wanted to add, I don't know if we're going to have this anytime soon, but it would be wonderful. There was a report released in the Netherlands about the suggested amount of investment that every company held aside for cybersecurity, and it was roughly 10% of the IT budget. So, if your IT budget is at 100 million euros, then 10% of that budget would be reserved for all of your cybersecurity costs, for your OPEX and for your CAPEX per annum. So it would be wonderful if we would see that type of guideline come from the EU towards the suggested spend on cybersecurity.
There's a specific suggestion. Great. So let's turn to the international level now. And Guilherme, I'm going to start with you if you don't mind. So obviously there's been a discussion for many years now. It's got quite a track record within the UN as well on to what extent states, are allowed to attack or not in cyberspace, and what exactly responsible behavior would look like for countries. You've been at the forefront of this discussion. You've shared the main group that deals with this discussion. Could you just quickly run us through where we are now in terms of the agreed norms and where you think we'll be in, say, a year time?
Well, thanks a lot for having me here to Political and Aspen Institute. We've been, this started in 1998 at the UN, and then we started having what we call these groups of governmental experts. First one, 2004. The one I currently chair is Group of Governmental Experts number 6. So this is the 6th edition of this exercise. The group is comprised of experts from 25 countries, member countries of the UN, United Nations, representing different regions of the world. So we're meeting for about 2 years and a half. We're supposed to conclude our task by 2021. The last session should be in May, and then we have to report back to the 76th General Assembly, to the first committee. The group has a mandate. It's an advisor group to the Secretary General of the UN. We work in the group as experts. So we have experts' opinions. We're not necessarily representing official position of governments. So all of the important governments, the big players, and also developing countries, the full range or spectrum of interests is represented in this group. We discuss on the basis of previous reports that were adopted in 2010, 2013, and 2015. Those reports taken together, they form what I call an acquis of what has been agreed to internationally. So the approach has been to adopt these norms of responsible state behavior in the cyberspace, but it's in the context of peace and security. So we're not dealing with all sorts of behaviors. We're dealing with behaviors that can impact on international peace and security and behaviors of states, not just of any actor. So it's a bit of a specialized discussion, but all these things that I'm hearing from the debate just right now, they flow into our discussions very clearly. They have a very strong presence there, because we're discussing the 11 norms that were adopted in 2015 and endorsed by the General Assembly. So they're the 11 norms that you probably know of, because they have been guiding initiative at several levels. The EU takes them into consideration in all the directives that are produced there, and other regions take them into account as well. So what we're right now trying to do is see if we can get an extra layer of common understanding that adds value to what has been achieved so far. It's a discussion in the multilateral context, so it's very difficult, and it's a discussion on the basis of security concerns and great power competition. So of course, we have to test what is the middle ground here, and the willingness of all the actors in the world, the state actors, to compromise on another layer of common understanding that makes these norms of responsible behavior, that gives them greater depth. So we're trying to provide guidance as to what the norms are, what they're meant to achieve, and how they can be best implemented by all at different levels, including at the regional level and at the national level. And then the norms speaks for themselves. We're trying to give them greater depth and an expanded interpretation, if you will, or at least a commentary on them that would be agreeable to all nations. So I think that would be a huge step forward right now if we can do that. We're also discussing how international law should apply or applies. It does apply to cyberspace. So we have to have a harmonized understanding. I think someone mentioned harmonization of practices among states. So that's relevant for us as well. And then there's a lot of confidence building measures and a lot of concerns with capacity building. so that we can have a more level playing field in terms of each country's capacity to identify and respond to threats individually and in a cooperative manner. Critical infrastructure is a major issue. We, in general, think that critical infrastructure should be defined and characterized at the national level, because they speak to the essence of each nation. And for each nation, different things might be critical. So we're not proposing, let's say, an international definition of what it is, but we are aware that it's important to define it and to protect it.
You mentioned the acquis, the norms that were agreed in 2015 and before that, and that sort of are considered consensus globally as no-go zones. I have to do a reality check on that. Are you confident or do you believe that since 2015 the world has become safer in terms of cyberspace because of these norms?
Well, I think the norms, so I see it from a different angle. The absence of any norms would have made things worse currently. But if the world has become perhaps more vulnerable to cyber attacks, it's not just a matter of the norms existing or not. I think that's the consequence of developments in the technologies themselves and the expanded use that's being made of the virtual world for all sectors and all interests of society. Applies on this digital infrastructure. So of course, as it expands, it becomes much more vulnerable, and the technology evolves in a benign and also in a non-benign and a very malicious manner. So the norms are needed. I think we have to expand the norms, deepen the norms, and increase nations' commitments around these norms, because of course they're very well-meaning. The norms make a lot of sense, and they do provide a basis for positive and cooperative action against these threats. How do you impose the norms upon states? That's a different question. This is a difficult question, but I think the norms are needed, and we need more clarity on the norms. Not necessarily more norms, but more clarity. And of course, we do need more commitment and common understanding around the norms.
Jaya, if I can get your gut check on this, because you look at the threat actors, you look at the landscape. To what extent, is the element of state-backed groups versus other actors? To what extent, what is critical infrastructure's problem? Where is it coming from?
Well, there's two types of things. So there's always the opportunistic attack. So if we take a look at the original WannaCry, for example, which had a collateral damage on the national healthcare system in the United Kingdom, we can speak of an attack that was specifically targeting the NHS, but they were also attacked in a larger scale effort. And then I can say that we don't have ransomware targeting hospital. What is different from the WannaCry NHS attack to the more recent attacks that we've seen, for example, at the Brno Hospital in the Czech Republic, or at the attacks on the World Health Organization since COVID-19 starts, these are targeted. They're quite deliberate, and they're very, very different than what we saw before. So I think that, we need to unilaterally condemn these types of acts, targeted attacks against critical infrastructure, specifically in a time when we absolutely can't afford it, but also look at what type of state backing exists for these types of ransomware campaigns. And although I'm wary of, calling out specific states, I feel like it's remiss of me not to mention that there are states that are heavily incentivized simply because it provides them access to capital to conduct ransomware campaigns that actually demand payment from their victims. And there's one very specific nation state that's garnered nearly a billion, actually I think it's even greater amount of money, simply through global ransomware campaigns. And I find this type of behavior ridiculous, that it's condoned and not called out.
Alejandro, the Commission and the EU more broadly has been working a lot on responding at the international level. One of the tools that's been used since this summer, actually for the first time, is sanctions in response to cyber attacks. Another round of sanctions is coming. We reported last week. So what's your take on how Europe can actually make sure that these norms are better abided by in the rest of the world?
Well, I think, first of all, that I very much agree with what the ambassador has said. I mean, the key we have, including the 2015 resolution, is a good basis. Among other things, it recognizes something crucial, which is that international law on state behavior applies online just as it does offline, and this is very important. And by the way, this is the approach that we take for everything digital, whether it's not just state behavior, but taxation, privacy, and fundamental rights, competition rules. This is really the basis, and we've seen some attempts within the UN system to question that. So I think the basis is good, but obviously the rules are just as good as the states who signed them actually implementing them. And this is where, indeed, at the EU, we have developed a certain toolbox, called it the cyber diplomacy toolbox, to improve our resilience and also to deter attacks. And I think you mentioned that indeed the most important part of that is the sanctions regime. We have now a horizontal cyber sanctions regime, which we had those listings in June of individuals and entities from 3 different countries, which were attributed attacks in EU member states. And this is incredibly important because not only it raises the cost of attacks, but it gives a crucial signal of European solidarity, because it shows that you may attack only one of us, but the moment that this attack is attributed to you is as if you attacked all of us, because you will bear the economic consequences of being blocked from a single market of 27 states. So I think this is something, this is a very important step that we've taken, and as you said, we continue working on.
We've got a couple of questions from the audience. First, I want to throw one at Guilherme because it's so topical. I came across a proposal this week by all European Union countries and a number of other international allies, a proposal to set up a permanent forum on cyber norms within the UN that would include the group that you chair and also another group called the Open-Ended Working Group, and sort of combine these two and make sure that there's a permanent discussion at the UN on these cyber norms. What's your take on this proposal that seems to be having quite a broad backing in the international community?
Well, I think there's a lot of interest in finding a path forward. I think the issue will only become more and more important and relevant. It will not go away. So obviously, discussions need to be ongoing. They need to be inclusive. Right now, we have 2 separate processes that are mutually reinforcing each other, but they're separate at the UN itself. So we ended up with 2 resolutions, 2 processes, the GGE, which I chair, 25 members, and then you have the Open-Ended Working Group, chaired by my colleague, Ambassador Jörg Lauber of Switzerland, which includes all members of the UN. Of course, the dynamics are a little bit different when you have, experts talking on their individual capacities in a closed room amongst 25 members only, and when you have delegates representing official missions to the UN, representing 193 UN member states. So it's a different level of discussion, but the topics are the same. It's the same concern, same agenda. This issue of a permanent structure for debating cybersecurity at the multilateral level is more specifically touched upon in the mandate of the Open-Ended Working Group. So they are addressing that head on. In my case, the group is a little bit more technical. We are trying to deepen our understanding in all these different things that we talked about, the norms themselves, the confidence building measures, the transparency measures, the capacity building, our views on the application of international law, issues dealing with human rights, privacy, including privacy of individuals, and all things that are central to protecting critical infrastructure, but at the level of peace and security concerns. So we are not really focused on crime per se, or terrorism per se, or malicious activity of private persons that do not have a clear impact upon peace and security or the relationship within countries under a kind of peace and security framework. So it's very security oriented, my debate. But I think the issue of a longer term venue for discussing this subject is very present in everybody's mind, and probably something will come out in this respect from the open-ended working group. I'm trying to deliver some substance for that if it happens in the future.
Great. So I'll take one question from the audience. This one feeds right into the discussion on international relations. The question is from Anonymous, unfortunately. Maybe he comes forward later, or she, excuse me. The question is, there is a lot of talk at the EU level and in member states about technological sovereignty right now. How dependent is Europe on China and the US when it comes to cybersecurity? Alejandro, that sounds like a question that's made for you.
Well, the question is, how dependent is Europe? So I think there are two very different things. One is the cybersecurity of our member states. And there, that's obviously something that is in their hands, but that we, as Commission at EU level, we very much support, both on the civilian side through R&D programs, but also we will from now on, from next year on, also on the defense side. So we will have a European Defense Fund, and for the first time, we will be able to finance defense capability projects done cooperatively among member states, and cybersecurity capabilities will be a big part of that. So I think in that respect, we're making big inroads. Then a completely different question is how dependent European industry, European market participants are on third country technology for their cybersecurity. I think there are starting points that we have an open market, and obviously everyone who complies with the rules is welcome to participate, but we also incentivize and try to support the development of European industry in cybersecurity through, as I mentioned, substantially increased public funding through R&D, and we will hopefully soon we'll have agreement to set up a new cybersecurity competence center, a network of centers to try to federate those investments. And we also try to create a more streamlined single market for cybersecurity, which is important because that is what it allows those companies to achieve scale through the let's say the size of the single market, and there I think the work that our cybersecurity agency NISA is doing on certification of cybersecurity products will be very important. So I think we have quite a lot in that agenda going forward.
Jaya, you work for a very prominent European cybersecurity firm. Avast is headquartered in Europe. How do you feel about sort of Europe's place in the global cybersecurity sector? And do we need, for instance, more European champions when it comes to this field?
So absolutely, because when you take a look at what we have going for us in Europe, we have a lot of very, very smart and talented people doing some amazing work. But I think it would be presumptuous to think that we have a leadership role in cybersecurity compared to the United States. And arguably, we still have a large amount of dependency. So if I would just make it a very rough categorization, for the majority of us, for our software, hardware, and operating systems, we are not fully self-sufficient. So if there's this idea of digital sovereignty, it's hard to make the case that you can source everything from Europe. And especially in the field of emerging technologies, this is an area that I'm very much concerned about. And I'm taking something now that's not directly related, but indirectly related, which is the area around quantum computing. I think this is something that we really should try to make a place for the digital sovereignty of Europe, which poses an existential threat, in fact, to cybersecurity. And from a software perspective, we're dependent on the US, and from a hardware fabrication perspective, also for a lot of our chip stuff and everything else, we're dependent on China. So unless we find different ways to do manufacturing and innovation, we will continue to lose ground on those areas.
Interesting. Let me just take one more question from the audience, and this one sort of adds to it, but looks at a bit of a different aspect. This one is from Ivy Yang, and the question is, how at the international level can we balance or manage the different standards pushed by leading powers given the current geopolitical tension? I think this goes into the question of the US having different standards and other countries like China being very active in international discussions around standards. So this is an open question to whoever is interested. What's Europe's role in that, and can Europe sort of find a balance between making sure that there's a connection to all sides of the globe?
Well, yeah.
Guilherme.
Okay, it's a difficult question. I would just like to say that one of the norms addresses the issue of supply chain integrity in that area, in the cyber realm. And I think, this issue is extremely important and also sensitive. There's a bit of an interface between great power competition and concerns with peace and security, and then relationships of amongst countries with respect to technological dependency upon particular suppliers. But here, the notion is to try to arrive at a common understanding and a common ground as to what would be the responsible behavior in terms of ensuring that supply chains have an integrity to them, that you have a commitment to report vulnerabilities to the extent that you have identified them and you have the capacity to do that, and then the political will to reveal that you have found those vulnerabilities and to share this with others, regionally, if you will, globally, would be best. So all these things that would be responsible to do, we're trying to encourage countries to adopt that particular standpoint. Of course, it's easier said than done. They also have to agree as to what are the responsible behaviors in detail. It's not a simple thing to do, but there's also a bit of an interface between security and trade here that creates a bit of difficulties towards achieving agreements right now, given the geopolitical tensions that were referred to by the person who posed the question. But hopefully we can, it's a diplomatic exercise. So our goal is to try to find the way to bridge these complexities and difference and advance the responsible behavior globally.
And with that, I think we're going to have to bring this discussion to a close. Let me thank you all three for joining, and let me say that it was a very interesting exchange of thoughts. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for that. To the audience online, thank you for joining and thank you for listening. You can share your thoughts. You can continue this discussion. As you know, we're on Twitter at the hashtag Politico Spotlight, and our details are also available online. Most of all, let me thank our partner for this online event, which is the Aspen Institute Romania. Aspen Institute Romania is hosting its Bucharest Forum 2020. That's still going on tomorrow, October 16, and you can find the details online on our channels and on theirs. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion. Politico will host additional virtual events this week. You can find those details on politico.eu, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time. Good afternoon.